Now, listen, you came up with musical skills and were in a band, right? The LA
Right.
Teens. And so that's an important factor here. I want to point out that, and you touch on this, I think, in the book a little bit, which is, the early days of the recording industry, right? Engineers, you look at EMI, right? The lab coats, and studios had their staff, right? Their personnel. And certainly you came out of that world and then became an independent engineer, an early successful in-demand independent engineer. And so you have your musical skills, your music knowledge, your music capabilities. How did that inform and how did you incorporate those musical sensibilities into producing and then engineering and mixing? Can you talk about that?
Yes. My parents moved to Los Angeles area my senior year of high school. And I met some guys that were starting a band, and I played keyboards and primarily organ. And I said, do you think an organ would fit in? And they said, let's try it. So we started writing songs, and we finally saved our pennies and went into a local studio and cut some demos. And one of the kids' mothers knew someone who knew someone that was in the music business. And that someone was a guy named Gary Usher, who was actually good friends with the Wilson family of the Beach Boys. In fact, he wanted to be a Beach Boy. That obviously didn't happen, but he did write 409 and In My Room with Brian.
Whoa.
So he liked our demo and asked us to come in for a meeting, and his office at the time was at Capitol Records. And of course, I'm jumping up and down, because I assumed that the Beach Boys recorded there. They were on Capitol. And so when he took us down to see the studios, and I said, is this where Brian works? And he said, no, he works across town in a studio called Western. So he had just made a deal with MCA, and he signed us to MCA. So we recorded at Capitol Studio B, and he brought in a session guitar player named Richie Podler to augment the band. And this guy was phenomenally talented. And while we were talking, he told me he was building his own studio. And so in those days, you did 4 songs and put out a single or 2. And if you got lucky with a hit, you ran in and cut 6 more. Suffice it to say, we only recorded 4 songs for MCA, for Decca. So then I went over to Richie and I said, we got dropped. And he said, oh, you guys were great. He said, look, I'll get you a deal. Go see this guy, Mike Curb. He's going to go places. And I went, oh, okay. And so we signed again, still had to have our parents sign because I wasn't 18 yet. And this is where it all happened for me, because here we had recorded at Capitol, and I did an organ solo in Brian's room at Western, which was, needless to say, nerve-wracking for me. But here we recorded in these 2 modern, beautiful, 2 of the best studios in Hollywood. And now Richie's studio was a lot funkier and whatnot, wasn't all shiny and pretty and whatnot. But we did our first track, came into the control room, he hit play, and I looked up at those speakers at the sound that was coming out. And when the track was over, I turned to Richie and I said, can you teach me how to do all this? Pointing at all the equipment. He said, no, I'm teaching Cooper. Get out there and do another take. But that was the aha moment, as I wrote, that I knew right then that I wanted to know how to do that, because our band had never sounded like that. And I realized that the big difference was the emotional added value from a well-recorded track, which Richie was way ahead of the game in 1965.
That's a really important point in the book. And I related to it, and I'm glad you mentioned that. You had the aha moment where what came out of those speakers affected you differently.
And I wanted to know how to do that, because all the thoughts that were racing through my head, we had just been in these great studios that had top engineers and so on. And here in this funky little place, I've got more emotion than I had in all the recordings put together. So when the band failed, which unfortunately it did, I went out on my own and was fortunate to come across my second mentor, the guy named Toby Foster, who was a very technical-oriented guy and also a very good engineer, especially with orchestras. And he was a tech at a studio in Glendale called Whitney. I went back to college. I'd taken 2.5 years off of college, which my Jewish doctor father was not very happy about. Yeah. And I went back to college and would come every day after school to Whitney and start asking Toby questions. What is a condenser mic? What's a dynamic mic? Till he couldn't take any more, and he would say, okay, enough, go home, see you tomorrow. And that was fabulous for me. But where the technical side meets the musical side meant that engineering came very easy to me. especially with Toby being the great patient teacher that he was. He could feed me as much as I could take, at least in any one evening. And so as things developed for me, only thing I wanted to do was write songs. And if I couldn't be an artist, if I didn't have a band, our band broke up after the second record deal fell apart, I at least wanted to maybe produce records. If if those really good engineers at Capitol and Western couldn't do it, I wanted to figure out how to do it so that I could do it. It's funny. I mean, I can't not think of myself as an engineer, but I still think of myself more as a musician than an engineer. And I think that has really served me well in terms of especially mixing.
Well, look, that comes through in the book because you talk about, so many either cautionary tales or success stories where the music guided the work, right? And people will look at your credits and often they will see mixer, right? Even though you have obviously other credits as producer and recording engineer, but very specifically, you've been tasked with mixing. I wanted to ask you about the specific challenges of getting, back in the day, it would be a reel, right? Getting a reel of tape, or now digital files, right? And not having perhaps been there at the session, not in some cases, I know you described, not even getting track sheets, right? Where you're opening up a Christmas present, right? You're opening up what is this, right? Take the question to the next level, so you've got this musical set of skills and you've got this emotional toolkit that you bring to the table. And then you got to put that reel on the Studer and hit play, right? How do you approach that? What's that look like for you?
Well, the first thing is when I heard what I heard out of Richie Podler and I wanted to learn how to do it, I ended up in a very Mickey Mouse studio. But it was a place to begin learning. And the best part of it was that's where I met Toby Foster, that, as I said, he would go on to teach me all the basics. The good part about that studio was it was only 2-track. The bad part was he had egg cartons on the wall. He had 2 condenser microphones, 2 professional microphones. He had a simple mixer with no equalization and only a spring reverb for echo. But it was 2-track, which meant that everyone that came in there recorded everything live.
Yeah.
And within 6 months, the owner was having me do all the sessions because he saw that I was better than he was, which wasn't saying much, believe me, but I could balance music. And that's all it took at that point, once you learned how to align the tape machine and put the microphones. So 8 months into it, I'm complaining to Toby about the fact that I'm working with mediocre musicians and mediocre equipment. And he said something that I hated hearing at the time, but was so true. He said, what you're learning while you're doing this with the Mickey Mouse equipment and the Mickey Mouse musicians and singers is going to so pay off when you're on good equipment with great singers and great artists and whatnot. And that's true. So back to the point, yes, the idea of balancing music. And to me, I make it very clear in the book, I really believe in my case, maybe in all cases, I think it's a God-given gift. It's like when I'm around super, super talented people and being a guy of faith, I will talk to them and say, you really have a great gift. And, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. I'm just curious, do you know who gave you the gift? That's how I open up the conversation sometimes with them. And mixing, balancing for me is that, it just, I don't know how it happens. That was one of my fears in writing the book about any of the technical stuff, because the biggest part for me is that gift. It just happens, the balancing thing. It's always been there, except twice when it wasn't there. I don't know if you've hit that chapter yet, but it's painful as it is. There were 2 times in my life when I sat down at the console and I knew what everything did, and I started doing what I normally do, and I knew I couldn't do it. It wasn't right. I was not about to get happy with it. And it really hurt. Both of them hurt. The first one was Melissa Manchester, who several years earlier I had mixed her first album, Midnight Blue, which was the hit that brought her into the world. And I couldn't do it. The second one was even worse for me because it was Maurice White of Earth, Wind & Fire, one of my favorite bands of all time. And the opportunity to mix something for Maurice, which he was the brains, for those that don't know, he was the brains behind Earth, Wind & Fire. And as I always say, George Massenburg, who mixed those Earth, Wind & Fire records, is a very good friend of mine. And I would go, and in the 70s, I would maybe stop in. And, what are you doing, George? Earth, Wind & Fire. Oh, and you mind if I stop down? And I'd go down and I'd sit over his shoulder. And he was doing an excellent job, don't get me wrong. but I just wanted my hands on those faders in the worst way. Just let me, I want
Sure.
that. So now I have the chance with Maurice's solo album, which was very much an EWF record, and it just didn't happen. Very sad. But anyway, yeah, so it's always been a very natural kind of thing for me.
I'm fascinated by that in general, the idea of instinct, the idea of gifts, the intangible. And sometimes that is lost in the world of technology, because ones and zeros and faders and buttons and, oh, do you have these converters, et cetera, as opposed to hitting play and, ooh, that hits me, that emotional impact.
And there's so many things that go into that, because I started professionally at the end of 8-track. And when you recorded, you couldn't put one instrument on a track. You had to put sometimes several instruments on a track. And you for sure had to balance the drums up on usually 2 tracks at the most, if it was going to be in stereo. And 8-track, we were still doing a lot of mono drums. So there was a lot of balancing to be done on the spot. And there's no tomorrow. Once those instruments are locked in, that's it. Well, we went on to 16, to 24, to 48 in the analog and early digital world. And now on a hard disk recorder, the sky is the limit. But what you're talking about also is the fact that it's become such a cerebral thing as opposed to instinctual. For me, when computer mixing started, and what computer mixing was in the late 70s into the 80s, was moving faders. There were consoles or a system that you could buy that you moved the faders and a computer caught those moves, and then you went back to the top of the song and hit play, and there the computer made all those same moves, and you could adjust them and change them and whatnot. And when I started on that, I had a really rough time letting that thing help me, because it was fighting me. It was fighting me. It was like, wait a minute, and I'd start grabbing it and I'd take over, and because it didn't feel right. If you ask any of my friends or my wife, I'm the least dexterous person you've ever met. I mean, I'm a klutz from the word go. Until you put me on a console with faders, and I don't care how many there are, it amazes me. I'm just all over the place. So that's what was the problem. I was fighting those moving faders and whatnot. Now, I finally made my peace with them, which was a very good thing, because we went on from there to Pro Tools, where everything is resettable, to the max and whatnot. And it made that learning curve much easier for me. And so I got very proficient on Pro Tools, which was a necessity. I realized early on that things are going to change, technology is going to change. I mean, it sounds so silly now, but I remember in the early 80s when I had in my studio the computer that did the moving faders. That's all it did. And I was sitting there with the assistant once while I was typing something in onto the computer, and I said, I wouldn't be surprised someday if we're not making records completely on a computer. And at the time, that sounded silly. And now today, what? Did you have outside toilets too? What do you mean? No, but it wasn't that long ago,
I have to ask you about some drummers, because there are several that are connected to you in your career. I mean, I have to. I would have friends that will chase me down and beat me if I don't mention these people. Number one, Jeff Porcaro.
Yeah.
I know that you did a lot of work with him, and if I'm correct, you were close.
Yeah. I came across all of the Toto guys. Steve Lukather, the guitar player, in his book, he was very complimentary to me because I hired him when he was 19. And Jeff was probably 22 or something, or 3 when I first worked with him. But just my favorite, the human being and the drummer. And, there's drummers that are excellent and have a certain feel and whatnot. Then there's guys that can add so much to a session. And that's the category that Jeff is in. He's a musician's drummer. The old joke that I'm sure you heard is that, a drummer is a guy that hangs out with musicians. But
yeah, of course.
I would punch anyone in the mouth if they said that about Jeff. He was just the greatest. Yeah, we were close. And one day he came in for a session, something I was producing, and he said, "Why don't you go out and play and let me get the sounds?" And I thought, there ain't no way I am going to play 2 hits on a set of drums with Jeff Porcaro in the room. Not even close. But after his passing it was rough on a lot of people. It really was. And, Lee Sklar, the famous bass player, he interviewed a bunch of drummers about Jeff, and he picked me also to do the interview. And I told him I had to write it, because as I started thinking about what I was going to say at home, I started tearing up. And sure enough, even reading the stupid thing on the video, I teared up. And this was several years after his passing. But yeah, I always knew it. Jeff never said it in these words, but once at a party after his departure, his brother Steve introduced me to someone at the party and said, Jeff, this is Bill Schnee. He was Jeff's favorite engineer.
Ooh,
and
man.
Boy, did that make me feel great.
That is absolutely something special. Holy cow.
Did you ever watch his instructional video?
Of course. Yeah.
And the microphones that are on the toms?
Sure, of course.
Yeah,
right.
those 251s. These are the,
yeah.
For those that don't know, one of my favorite tube microphones is a microphone that was built by AKG but marketed through Telefunken. And it's called a 251. And it was my favorite first tube mic that I got into. And I got into these mics through Toby, who said, you should listen to these tube mics. I think you're going to like them. And I bought as many as I could get my hands on. And it was easy because so many people, studios and whatever that owned them, radio stations, they wanted the new transistor version because it was newer. And as I learned, newer isn't, an analog especially, newer isn't always better. Digital, it's another thing because we keep learning and getting better. But analog, it wasn't always better. So these microphones, I paid $400 and $500 for. I have a standing offer right now for $20,000 for as many as I want to sell. But I had so many. And even back then, when his instructional video, they were probably worth $10,000 a piece. I had so many that I had Toby internally pad the microphones so they could take level, and I put those on the toms, but only on a very few guys. Jeff is obviously one of them, but it's so funny because not just drummers, but anyone that was interested in Jeff Porcaro and they see that video, and if they talk to me and anywhere, ask me a question, it's like, were those really 251s on the toms? No one could believe that someone was that stupid to put that expensive a mic on a tom.
It's rare. It's a rare sight, I know. And the thing I would like to add about Jeff, for those who are uninitiated or don't realize, the breadth of his work, is not only the stuff that he's famous for, but so many sessions and dates that he played on that you don't even realize, like, oh man, that's Jeff Porcaro on drums, and just so many records.
Absolutely.
And from young age too.
Yeah.
Let me follow that up, of course, with Steve Gadd. Some of Steve's most famous tracks, you have worked with, and I love the tales of, I think it's with Richard Perry, right? Where he sort of asks to get Gadd on the date and then just crushes it.
You had to bring up Asia. I knew you would. And
I'm gonna get hate mail, man.
Yeah. So
but I didn't name check it. So there you go. I didn't, ask about the stick click or anything, Bill.
Yeah.
So give me a break.
So when Gary Katz asked me if I wanted to record the next Steely Dan album, and I got off the floor, he told me that it was going to be a revolving door of drummers. I said, oh, cool, that's it. So you'll be getting a new drum sound every few days. And one day, this guy, Steve Gadd, was coming in. Now, I knew Steve. I was very impressed with Steve from 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, which has that great drag snare thing going.
Yeah.
So I was very excited to work with him. And we cut 2 songs the first day, both great. And I called Richard Perry, who I hadn't been working with for a while, and told him, I said, man, gosh, he's here and he's everything I thought he would be. And he said, do you think I could do a session with him? And I said, well, I don't know. We start at 2:00. Let me ask Gary, the producer. So I asked Gary, and Gary was highly respectful of Richard. And he said, okay, sure. But he also knew Richard's ways, and Richard had a tendency to take forever to get a track. So he said, but you can't go over. The guys will kill me if we don't start on time. So I said, okay. So I called Richard back and said, yeah, you can do it 10:00 tomorrow morning, but we've got to be done on time. So
and this is Leo Sayer, right? This is the Leo Sayer session,
yeah.
Right?
So he shows up the next morning with a little guy from England that's very jovial named Leo Sayer, and we set up to do this track, and Leo goes out to sing the guide vocal for the band. And this was one of those times, you don't always know it, but this was one of those times when practically the first run through, I went, we're cutting a hit record right now. Just the way he started off with, I can't get up there anymore. The melody and whatnot, but right there with it, listen to it if you've forgotten it, listen to that song, You Make Me Feel Like Dancing, and hear Steve Gadd's drumming, where once again, that drag snare plays a tremendous part. It's just an absolute big, part of the groove that might not have been the same thing with anyone else.
Amazing, amazing. And I love the fact that, and I can almost picture you in a way, like when it's coming out of the speakers and you're like, oh yeah, oh man, we got a hit. Like,
Yeah.
Jim Keltner, right? On
Oh,
so
yeah.
many other sessions, and great player. Got a
Fabulous.
sound,
Yeah. Being a wannabe drummer and studying drummers and drums as much as I have, the idea of feel comes into play. And what does that mean? And I think, and I did a pretty good job in the book of describing it, although I think I could do it better now, second edition, about what goes into that. And it's how the brain controls the four appendages, the two arms and two legs, with the instruments that they're playing, where some people will just have a natural bend for, like Keltner, for instance, his backbeat is back. His backbeat is behind the beat, left to his own devices. Don't make him play to a click, but if you just let him play a groove and then measure it, you will find his kick drum and ones will be right on it, but that 2 and that 4 are going to be just a little bit back. And that's just something that I just personally love. Jeff was good at that as well. Other drummers that are still great drummers, incredible. Jim Gordon,
Yeah.
opposite, stays right on top of the beat, right on the front edge of that. Those 2s and 4s are right there, if not leaning a teeny bit. Doesn't rush necessarily, but that kind of thing. And still a great, great drummer.
And machines don't do that.
No.
Last drummer, I promise, Vinnie Colaiuta. Like one of my favorites, of
Yeah,
course.
just amazing. Just an incredible, well, all of these that you've mentioned, just incredible human beings. Great story about Vinnie is he came out of the Mothers of Invention, and he is a jazzer. He's one of these guys like Simon Phillips, another one of my favorite.
Yeah.
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 That, time signature, what's that? Crazy ones too, just insane crazy ones, and can shift from one to the next, And you had to do that when he started.
Sure.
So,
yeah, with Zappa, I mean, that was like, sit in the chair and I'm going to break you. And Vinnie could do it all. Yeah.
So he comes to town, he gets off the road, and he comes to LA to start doing sessions. And I had never worked with him, I don't think, when this story happened, but I'd heard all about him, that he's too many notes, because most records don't want that many notes. You got to kind of find, quote, the groove and stick with it, kind of thing. And he couldn't help himself. So I got called to produce a end title for a Richard Pryor movie, and they had another producer scheduled to do it, and it fell out in negotiations, but it was already booked. And the session was booked with all the musicians. And so the music supervisor called me and said, now here are these people, but we have plenty of time. We can change if you want to change any of them. And lo and behold, Vinnie Colaiuta was on it. And I knew I was cutting an R&B-ish kind of song, and I didn't want too many notes. So I said, yeah, I think I need to just change Vinnie to another drummer. And I think Jeff wasn't available, so I got Carlos Vega, who was another very great drummer.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So perfect. So we get to the studio, and I look out, and there's 2 sets of drums, and in walks Vinnie Colaiuta. And the music supervisor comes, I go running up to him, and I said, Vinnie is here. And he goes, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I forgot to cancel him. It's okay. I'll go soften the blow and tell him we're going to pay him. So he goes out. I hide. He goes out and tells him that, and that's that. Now you jump ahead probably 6 years, 7 years. I'm in my studio, and I'm cutting a track with Vinnie Colaiuta, and we just did a real driving song because he had learned, everyone saw that he was an incredible musician. So a lot of the other guys on sessions were telling him, you got to play less notes. You just got to settle down and play less notes. And so we had just recorded him, and he had done a great track like that. And we actually went to the men's room, and we're standing next to each other, and too much information. And I said, Vinnie, do you remember about 6 years ago when you showed up at Record Plant for a film date and you weren't needed and they sent you home? And he went, yeah, I do. I said, I was the producer on that. He goes, you were? And I said, yeah, I didn't think you could do it, because it was an R&B thing. And he said, you're absolutely right. I couldn't back then. And it worked perfectly, like I said, because we had just done a driving R&B track 10 minutes earlier. So it worked perfectly. He said, you were absolutely right in doing it. I would have done the same thing.
Oh, man. It's a good segue. Thank you for that. I'm just laughing, Vinny in the bathroom talking about that. It's funny. I want to wrap up with you. You brought up a good point about producing, and I wanted to ask you about that because you've worn these hats, especially I was just looking at your discography, and earlier as you started out, it was a lot of producing, right? And you're doing that, and then you settle into, you do a bunch of mixing for a while, and then you've done more producing throughout your career like that. And I wanted you to talk about wearing those different hats and what they mean to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've always said that both recording as an engineer and mixing as well, but let's just say engineering and producing are both servants' roles. We are there to serve the artist and their music. My job is the engineering, but I'm concerned about the music and what will make the music better and never get in the way, whatever that means. Producing for me is a lot more fun. Engineering is great when it's something really, really great to record. Some of those jazz things I've done, obviously Asia, those are wonderful. But the problem for me always came with a lot of engineering is that, I love engineering an orchestra session with 60, 70 guys, whatever. It's actually easier than a 5-piece rhythm section. Nobody believes me, but it really is. Because it's true. If you're in a great room, and you're going to be in a great room, and you've got a great orchestra, great notes on paper, and a great conductor, it's laughing. You set up the mics and you sit back and it just develops in front of you. There's not a whole lot to do. It's quite easy. Anyway, so they're both servants' roles. I'm a control freak, so, like I said, from that aha moment at Ritchie Podler's in the LA Teens, I wanted to learn how to control sound so that I could give that kind of emotion. And nothing makes me happier. Some of the response to the book have been people that are familiar with my work, and they talk about the emotion that's in my mixing, and nothing could make me happier because that's what shows me that I really succeeded at what I was trying to do. But being the control freak that I am, sure, producing is the ideal. Richard Perry told me, I started producing, then I got with Richard, and we started on a string of incredible records with Ringo and Carly Simon, Barbra Streisand, and then the Pointer Sisters. And he was the one that told me, giving me advice. He said, just make sure that you're working with artists that are worth your time and talent. And I think I took that a little too much to heart because I think I was actually too picky. I should have maybe taken more things than I did. I didn't want to do it unless it was, met too many criteria. But I'm not complaining. Believe me.
Well, I loved Piers Plaskett's story about he tracked something with the Pointer Sisters and it went away and it came back from your hands and ears and it sounded completely incredible and different. And he was like, oh, Bill Schnee. I love that story.
Very sweet.
It's like how it can be transformed by, a talent.
That was another problem I thought I might have writing the book, because a lot of my credits are just for mixing where the artist wasn't even there. I met the Pointer Sisters because I did mixing in Richard's studio. I met them while they were working in the next studio, but they never came to mixes. And so many things, I never met the artist. But I think a part of what was great and still is when somebody works on a record for a long amount of time, giving it over to fresh ears can be great. I may get, or any other engineer, may get a totally different take on it than how they've been looking at it. And I would find that all the time. A lot of times a producer would come in and listening to the mix and he'd go, what is that? I put that on there? Wow, yeah, you put that on there. I just made it more pronounced instead of in the background.
It's funny. I don't want to misattribute this quote. My understanding is it's from Sting. And he said, you don't finish mixing an album, you give up. And what's your reaction to that?
That's not me. Let's just put it that way. Well, let me rephrase that. It can be me, for sure. Especially one of the problems that I have as a producer is I don't do well mixing my own stuff. However, I have tried using another engineer, and that works even less well. So the problem, I think, is that I try too hard. And I've gotten a lot better at it because some friends would tell me, you get to the mixing of your stuff and you're treating it like you've just taken it in from someone else, where you start having to EQ everything and you're EQing the sounds that you've already gotten. stop it. Stop trying to reinvent the wheel. You did fine when you recorded it. Now just put it together. So that's what I try to do.
It's amazing. I mean, it's funny because you're reminding me a little bit of Vinnie at a drum clinic once would say, student raises his hand and says, Vinnie, I'm blown away by this thing you're doing. And, it's like so complex. And he goes, oh man, you just do it.
Yeah.
Of course, no one in the room can do it. So, nobody can.
It's exactly what I was talking about earlier. That's a gift. And like I said, he and Simon are the two for me like that. Like I said earlier, the feel of a drummer is based on how the brain works with those 4 appendages. I don't know what goes on in those 2 drummers' brains, but it's not normal.
Yeah, of course, I'm a big Simon Phillips fan. I'm a big fan of The Who and Pete Townsend. I know his work with them and, of course, all his more modern fusion stuff. And it's just an amazing player and a huge kit that he brings to every date he does,
Absolutely.
Toto, of course. He played with Toto and those guys.
Yep.
Yeah, so amazing player. Listen, speaking of talent and gift, you, sir, have been kind enough to share your time and your gifts with me today. So thank you. Thank you for writing your book, Chairman at the Board, Recording the Soundtrack of a Generation, Bill Schnee.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
Thank you for listening to the East Maine podcast. This is Brian Brodeur. Please don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends and leave us a good rating. We'd really appreciate it. If you want to drop us a line, you can, of course, visit our website, eastmainmedia.com, and follow us on social media at East Maine Media. And as always, please stay safe and healthy. Thanks for listening.